Osioni Gata, welcome to the Frontlines Are Everywhere podcast. And today we are fortunate to have Gord Hill as a guest. So Gord is an Indigenous writer, artist, and activist from Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, whose territory is located on northern Vancouver Island and adjacent mainland in the province of so-called British Columbia. He's the author and illustrator of the 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance comic book, the Anti-Capitalist Resistance comic book, the Antifa comic book, all published by Arsenal Pulp Press in Vancouver. His art and writing have been published in numerous periodicals, including Briar Patch, Canadian Dimension, Red Wire, Red Rising Magazine, The Dominion, Seattle Weekly, Broken Pencil, and he's been involved in Indigenous peoples and anti-globalization movements since 1990. So welcome, Gord. What for being on the podcast today. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, yeah. My name's Gord Hill. I'm from the Kwakwaka'wakw, and I'm currently living in Alert Bay on northern Vancouver Island in the Kwakwaka'wakw territory. And thanks for having me to talk about some of my work, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, I look forward to digging into it. And I think to start, I'll ask you kind of a broader question about Indigenous internationalism. It's kind of this idea that as Indigenous peoples, we're inherently international, to kind of quote Leanne Simpson, right? That we have all of these relational, forms of commitments and responsibilities. We have trade networks, we have treaties, diplomacies, activism that all transcend state borders and engage with other Indigenous nations. What does Indigenous internationalism mean to you, or does it resonate with you as an idea?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. I think I agree. Like, we had extensive trade networks and like these types of international relations. Like here on the coast, we went up and down the coast down to as far south as California, and we also had some kinds of relations with Hawaiians as well, and I believe also the Maori in New Zealand. But I think like there's a kind of a difference after colonization, because I don't know if we as Indigenous peoples would have considered, I think we had relations, but I don't think we had a concept so much of like international solidarity and pan-Indianism, which kind of arose more in the 60s and the 1970s here in North America. Because I think something that colonization did was it made us even more of like a common people. Like we share a common history of colonialism now. We shared a lot of common cultural traits, but one thing colonization did in North America was it gave us a common language. And I think we can see kind of like stronger relations between Indigenous people in North America, by which I mean Canada and the United States, and with like the Maori or the Aboriginal in Australia, from my experience. And that's because we actually share that language of English. So I think there's like a change from before colonization, when we had these international relations. I mean, almost like for the Kwakwaka'wakw on the coast here, I mean, any external relationship was international because we're dealing with the Nucha-North or the Coast Salish or the Tlingit or the Tsimshian. And there was strong alliances that were made, and they were kind of based on trade, but also intermarriage. So we had really strong relationships with the Nucha-North. And when the European colonial forces first arrived here, that relationship kind of enabled some of the Kwakwaka'wakw to arm themselves because they were trading with the Nucha-North. And so then in an anti-colonial resistance kind of context, those types of relationships became really important. But yeah, I think I do agree. We are like an internationalist people because we've always had these external relationships, whether it's trade or intermarriage. Um, but I do think it's been transformed somewhat by colonization. And now when I think of internationalism, well, I guess that to me actually, I guess that's my colonized mind. Now I think of like Australia and New Zealand or Hawaii. Um, and here in North America, I think it's partly because of this pan-Indian movement that arose. Um, it just seems we just have this kind of natural solidarity between Indigenous peoples all around North America. Um, and I think the origins of that go back to like the 18th century when the first kind of pan-Indian tribal confederacies were formed with like Pontiac and then Tecumseh. Um, and those were like really different too because those brought together a lot of indigenous tribal nations that didn't really have those types of relationships or certainly weren't allied in like a confederacy that was joined together, a military alliance to counter primarily the British in the eastern woodland regions there. So I think that's like part of the history of this internationalism as well, is those early confederacies that were formed.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think of the for Cherokee, we had the Chickamauga Confederacy led by Dragging Canoe, and it was this whole kind of, had adjoining nations like Shawnee and Creek, but also had British soldiers who had defected from the army, and then freedmen, so freed slaves. So yeah, it was that's really such a reflection of colonization in the sense that we all banded together to take on this common enemy, in this case the U.S. government, in the 1770s, and then lasted until about 1792 or so. And Tecumseh was part of that. He was in the camp at least. So yeah, what for that? That's such an important distinction, right? In terms of how the English language has created these, in some ways, senses of solidarity, but that's a colonial language, and that's part of the legacy of colonization. What I was thinking of your work, and you've got such a broad set of interests. Who are some of the people that you really look up to that have inspired your work all throughout your career or throughout your time, not only doing illustration but also doing some of the on the ground mobilization for change?
I think one of my earliest inspirations was actually Noam Chomsky, because my first political movement that I was involved in was a solidarity group for El Salvador, which was at the time was involved in a civil war, or had a revolutionary struggle. And so as a part of this, I really wanted to understand more of U.S. foreign policy in Central America. So I bought a book, I think it was recommended to me, Noam Chomsky's Turning the Tide. And it was really eye-opening and kind of transformed my way of thinking. But one of the things that really struck me was how much research Noam had done in this book, but also his use of reference materials. So it just seemed really like thoroughly documented and written in a fairly accessible manner. So nowadays I have a different opinion of Noam Chomsky because of comments he's made about more militant resistance groups like Antifa. But at the time, I never got into the Noam Chomsky kind of bandwagon because he had a lot of fans throughout the 1980s. But that his book and his style of writing had a big impact on me. Another author was Ward Churchill, he's also a controversial person. But for me, with him, with Ward Churchill's writings, it was, well, it was focused on Indigenous people, but it was also really well documented as well. So I found that it just seemed really authoritative. Like when he was talking about this history of Indigenous resistance, anti-colonial resistance, or his book Agents of Repression, when he's talking about, he's detailing the FBI's counterinsurgency war against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement, and that's kind of like I think both those books kind of reflected my interest in history and this historical documentation, and yeah, so those two had a big impact on me in terms of writing. I think the biggest impact for me was Louis Hall, who was a Mohawk, who he was an artist and a writer, and he developed the warrior flag that we see all across North America and in other places as well now, as like a symbol of Indigenous resistance. But he wrote the Warrior's Handbook, which was kind of like a short, like a zine almost, and just laying out his ideas about Indigenous sovereignty and the need to have some kinds of a defensive security force that he used. He used the term warrior society, and his writings were kind of more directed towards the Mohawks and the Haudenosaunee, I think. But his ideas are certainly applicable to Indigenous peoples across North America. So he did other paintings and graphics as well. But I remember when I was reading the Warrior's Handbook, he talked about things like sovereignty and that, but like not referring to your reserve as a reserve, but calling it a territory. So they had a movement in Ganohalidoh, so they called it the Ganohalidoh Territory or Ganohalidoh Mohawk Territory. And he had concepts about the warrior culture, reviving warrior culture, and yeah, that just really struck a chord with me as well. But I also really appreciated his writings and his artwork. Like he did a lot of paintings as well, but he was also like directly involved in these struggles, the Mohawks in the 1970s in Ganohalidoh and in Ganyange, which was a territory that the Mohawks went down and seized in 1974. And then there was an armed standoff and negotiations with New York State, and they eventually secured a piece of land that still exists to this day as kind of like a sovereign Mohawk territory. But he was involved in those really kind of militant struggles, and that's where he designed the warrior flag, and I think that's where he did a lot of his writing. So I found that really inspiring. And he kind of, I think part of his message was if you have, if you're or if you have good speaking skills, if you're an artist or a writer, then you should use these skills for the improvement of Indigenous peoples. And so that had a big impact on me too, because I had been involved in these kind of anti-imperialist struggles, like with the solidarity with El Salvador, and then I became involved in anarchist movements, and it was after Oka 1990 that's when I kind of started to focus more about Indigenous peoples and like just kind of connecting my own ancestry to these struggles that were going on. But Oka was such a watershed historical event, so it had a big impact on Indigenous peoples across North America, and it had a big impact on me. So yeah, Louis Hall's writings and his artwork were a really big influence for me. There's other artists as well, like Joe Sacco. He did mostly, I think it was a black and white comic about his experiences in Palestine, and I liked his style. It was really detailed, but yeah, I just kind of, and his documentary style of doing the comic, like it was just like a journal, but he made it into a comic book. And there was some other artists from World War III that I was kind of inspired by, like Seth Tabachman, just because their graphics were really strong, black and white, visual kind of graphics. So that had a kind of a big impact on me, because in the 90s, of course, we mostly were using photocopiers, so it's all black and white. And even if you go to print, your publications, it's doing full color publications was like prohibitively expensive. So everything was in black and white. So a lot of my graphics, a lot of my artwork just became black and white throughout the 1990s, because that's when I've devoted myself to mostly just making propaganda and graphics and logos and posters and stuff like that.
Yeah, you see the warrior flag everywhere now, right? And it's part of the Indigenous movements, and it's such an important part. So, yeah, it's great to hear about those inspirations. Well, when I first saw your work in 2010, it didn't look like this, but it was 500 Years of Resistance, and I remember thinking, I haven't seen anything like that. And now you've got the the update, the revised and expanded 500 Years of Resistance, which I was telling you I've used in my course a couple times, and it's been really well received. I was wondering, in 2010, when there wasn't really anything like that I saw, there may have been other kind of zines or other things like that. How did you get engaged in that work? What led you to say, hey, I've got to do a comic on 500 Years of Resistance? And that's a huge project, right?
Right. Well, I think a few years prior to that, starting in the late 90s, around 1997, I started working with the Native Youth Movement in Vancouver. And so these are young people. And at the time, there's really no internet, or it was very limited. And I kind of felt like even this, like our history of resistance it was hard to maintain. And even the recent acts of resistance, like Oka in 1990, I mean, the group had kind of a vague understanding of it. They knew that it was an armed standoff that had occurred, but I felt like there needed to be a way to kind of communicate this history, like have some kind of educational material about our history of resistance. So I started doing these 4 to 8 page comics that I could, and they were like the same size as a photocopy paper, 8 by 11 inches. So I started doing these comics, and whenever I got access to a photocopier, or whenever we went to a powwow or a conference, if I could just get access to a photocopier, I could make copies of these comics and distribute them. So that's what I started doing. And after a while, I had the comic about Oka, did a comic about the Ipperwash crisis of 1995, and the Gustafson Lake standoff of 1995. And I think maybe a couple others. And so I was distributing these, and then other people would get them, and they'd make copies. And so that's how these zines would get distributed. And after I had this little collection, someone had suggested that I should add some more chapters and try to make it like an overview of the 500 years of Indigenous resistance. So I did that. And then another friend of mine had a book published at Arsenal Pulp Press. So he brought a copy of this kind of a compilation of comics that I'd done, and they published it. So that was the first edition of the 500 years, and that's why it's in black and white. But then over time, my artwork had improved, because then I did some other comics as well with Arsenal, and I had access to much better information, because the internet was much more established, and there was Taino groups that had websites now, because that was because when I looked at that first edition of the 500 years, I thought that I could do such a much better job now. I could do it I could do it proper justice because my artwork was better. I'd learned how to color on the computer, so I could add colored graphics to it, and yeah, I just had so much better access to information, um, and I felt like there was a lot of gaps in that first edition, um, that I wanted to kind of fill, like especially with the Taino, because they were the first people to be encountered by Columbus and the first to actually start the anti-colonial resistance in all of the Americas was with the Taino. And then with the Mexica, I really wanted to show like how this empire had kind of been defeated by the conquistadors and their indigenous allies. And then with the Inca was another important story that I didn't think I did a very good job on in the first edition. And the Mapuche, I mean, that was the full history of the Mapuche was so much richer than I had presented. And they were the one indigenous nation that were never defeated by the Spanish. They actually fought them for hundreds of years and were never defeated. So these were important stories. And then there had been more acts of resistance that had occurred because the first edition had kind of left off just kind of briefly mentioning Six Nations in 2006, just kind of alluding to it because that was the last thing that kind of happened at the time, just as the comic was going to print. So that, of course, had been a huge movement. And then there was Elsie Pugtug and Idle No More and the Shutdown Canada movement. So I approached Arsenal about redoing the comic, and they agreed to do a new expanded version. So that's how the new edition came about.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I mean, the graphics are striking. I don't know if it'll do it justice to hold it up, but it's just incredible in terms of the comprehensiveness of it. Have you gotten, you mentioned Mapuche, have you gotten responses from people that have been on the front lines that have said, yes, I really liked the work? Have you gotten responses from other people that are, descendants of people that are in your book?
I can't say that I have actually.
Yeah. How about the response in general? What do people say when they've approached this work? What's some of the feedback that you get?
Feedback from teachers who find it really useful to have this type of a resource in the classroom as a supplement to the other textbooks and whatnot that they use. It's been translated into an Indigenous language. I mean, some chapters of it were translated into an Indigenous language in northern Quebec. People, and other than that, I find people who've responded to me have mostly commented about how they found it really eye-opening because they didn't know much about this history, so it was very revealing for them. Yeah, and it's kind of similar to the response with the first edition, where a lot of teachers were using it, and yeah, and I mean, I did get letters from young people that had said that it had really opened up their minds to the history of the real history of colonialism and the history of Indigenous peoples. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's I could see how it's going to impact future generations, right? Talking about, you've got this history of resistance in a really accessible format. And yeah, like I said, I haven't seen anything else like it. So it's really powerful. You have some other works that have been published, the Anti-Capitalist Resistance comic book, and you have the Antifa work. What impacts have you seen from some of those publications in terms of the people that are on the front lines of resistance?
Well, with the Antifa comic, it's there was Antifa groups that were purchasing it to distribute because they did a distribution of zines and books of anti-fascist material, so they were using it in their work. Um, it was translated into some different languages, including Korean, which I was a little surprised. So it's being distributed in South Korea. Um, I hope it contributed to that larger Antifa mobilization that was occurring. And I hope it helps to kind of maintain a history of anti-fascist resistance and just kind of make that history of fascism and the Nazi Germany and the continuation of these far right fascist groups. I hope it makes the history about that more accessible as well, because of course what we're seeing now is you know probably beginning with Trump in a big way, with Trump's first presidential run. That's when Arsenal asked me if I would be interested in doing the anti-fascist comic book, because we were seeing such a large upsurge or expansion of these fascist far right groups. Um, and that's kind of continued today. I think we're seeing still a proliferation of far right groups. And I think in some ways, you you did have this major struggle between the Antifa and these fascist far right groups. Um, but once Trump lost the election, I and you had the Capitol, um, the the Capitol riot or whatever, and then it, that seemed to take the wind out of their sails a bit, I would say. And you didn't have this like constant ongoing mobilization from groups like the Proud Boys. So the Proud Boys were hit pretty hard by the indictments and charges, and actually the sentencing that came out of these this incident. So the far right were kind of impacted by that, and to a large degree, I think, by the Antifa response. But these groups are all still all these people are out there still, so there is still a potential for. And now we have Trump running for re-election, and so there's always this potential for this far right um, growth to occur, and especially as we have these economic kind of crises and the climate crises. We just have all these crises right now, and so it's a very volatile time. And I think, yeah, I just hope that my comic contributes to that to some extent, promoting militant anti-fascism. Um, the anti-capitalist comic book, well, that one came out fairly soon after the 500 Years comic, and it focuses mostly on the anti-Olympics campaign, the G20, the 1999 WTO protests, and the 2001 Free Trade Area of the Americas, Summit of the Americas in Quebec City. Um, so that's kind of I think of all those comics, that one probably does the least well. Um, and I think it's just because it's kind of got this narrow, it's almost just like a documentation of those four major mobilizations. Um, and I don't know how much impact it had. I think for people who participated in those mobilizations, maybe, and for people who are really involved in anti-capitalist kind of anarchist organizing today, that might be a useful resource for them. But outside of that, I think it's somewhat limited.
Yeah, and it seems like these are such great reference points, right, for people that are activists. To have even that history of anti-capitalism. I remember the 1999, events, and really to connect it to today, right? Even with the slide to the right, the rise of fascist groups, neo-fascism in different countries, even in Brazil, Hungary, elsewhere, right? let's talk a little bit about your activism. You've been involved in frontline resistance movement since 1988. How have those experiences, or what are some of the experiences that you draw on for kind of inspiration, but also how have those experiences changed you over time?
One thing before I got into any kind of political social movements, I'd actually spent 5 years in the Army Cadets and a year in the Canadian Forces Reserves. So I had all this military training, and I mean, we did like firearms training, field craft, map and compass, first aid. But we also did a lot of organizing, like, and as we became NCOs and senior NCOs in the Army Cadet Corps, we became the instructors. So I took like a 6 week long course in public instruction, and that kind of gave me a foundation in public speaking, but also just like organizing, kind of thinking of logistics and stuff like that. So I had that, and then me and my mom moved to Vancouver, and I ran into a cousin of mine, and he was really into the punk rock scene, the punk movement. So I started going to shows with him and just getting exposed to punk lyrics and stuff like that. And it kind of made me start to question my military involvement, what I was doing with the military, because that was going to be my career. I was going to join the regular forces. But listening to punk kind of made me change my perspective. So I quit the military. I quit the reserves. And then I really got into punk, and I eventually got into anarchist punk. And I was listening to anarchist punk bands, and then I started picking up anarchist literature, magazines and newspapers, and then going to anarchist conferences and stuff like that. So I became really focused and involved in the anarchist movement from probably around 1987 to 1990. And in that time also got involved in anti-racist organizing. And in 1990 was the Oka crisis, so that's when I kind of like began to turn my attention or my energy more to Indigenous struggles. But still, from about 1990 to 1995, I kind of was involved in both. I was kind of involved in Indigenous struggles, organizing events and stuff like that in Vancouver. But then I was also involved in anarchist or any kind of anti-capitalist organizing or events that were going on, and also anti-fascist organizing, because then there started to be from about 1989 till about 1993, there was a larger neo-Nazi organizing happening in the city. And so all this is urban based as well. And then in 1995, there was the Ipperwash crisis, but also the Gustafson Lake standoff in the BC interior near 100 Mile House. And so that had a big impact on me because I was kind of like part of this core group that was organizing solidarity events in Vancouver, and also trying to organize to get these like NGO observers, these human rights observers up into 100 Mile House, and then doing interviews or with some of the people that were inside the rebel camp, as it were. And so I was really invested in this resistance that was going on. And from Oka in 1990 to the Gustafson Lake standoff in 95, the police and the state had refined its counterinsurgency techniques of how they're going to deal with these types of standoffs or these conflicts. And so at Oka, how the media had, some of the media had actually embedded with the warriors, and they were putting out daily reports and an analysis after that from like an anti-terrorist think tank. Their analysis was that this media coverage had provoked sympathy and solidarity among the general public in Canada. So a lot of people rallied in support of the warriors in Oka. So they advised that the media should be more strictly controlled and not have access to the participants in these acts of resistance. And then they'd also recommended that the military shouldn't be used in these types of confrontations, and that they should instead use a more militarized police force, because then they could keep it within kind of a criminalization strategy, because the deployment of the military and these lightly armed warriors standing up to this vastly superior military force had also proved to like a propaganda victory for the warriors, and had engendered more solidarity and support from the population. So these kind of strategies were used at Gustafson Lake. So they limited the media, they cut off all communications from the camp, and they surrounded it. And it was a much more rural location as well. So they had total control over the communications. And that kind of, it was like quite a different situation. It was much more contained, I think, in British Columbia. So you could go to other places, like other provinces, or especially down into the United States, and they'd never heard of this standoff for a few years afterwards, even. So it was kind of contained, and they of course had used the RCMP. They sent in all these emergency response teams, and they'd gotten assistance from the Canadian military with the Bison armored vehicles and weapons and ammunition. So it was a very different kind of situation. But the big thing about it was we were just everybody was just being told the government and the police version of events. So there was this really intense propaganda thing. So organizing in solidarity with the Gustafson Lake defenders was a big thing, because everybody was just like, oh my God, they're terrorists, they're this and they're that. The police had like all these dirty tricks that the police RCMP engaged in. Like they released the criminal records of Native people who weren't even in the camp, but that had been charged with and convicted of sexual assaults and stuff like this. And just this total smear campaign. Their lawyer, Bruce Clark, was smeared and made out to be an insane, because he argued that Canada should be held to account by constitutional law, and arguing the 1763 Royal Proclamation. So he was made to look like he was insane. And at one point, of course, the RCMP took him and imprisoned him in a psychiatric institute for a 3-day psychiatric review. And so it was just this intense repression around the defenders. And so those of us organizing solidarity with them, we face a lot of opposition from our own community, from Native people who just accepted this propaganda. And so we brought up actually one of Noam Chomsky's books, Manufacturing Consent, because that's what the RCMP, along with the government and the corporate media, were doing, are manufacturing consent for this deadly force to be used on the defenders at Gustafson Lake. And so there was a lot of emotional stuff going on with that, because a lot of people were like, they did not want to be associated with these guys at all in any way. It was insane. Of course, after the standoff, and then we had the year-long trial in Surrey in a high security courtroom that they built just for this. It was the most expensive criminal case in Canada's history. I mean, it was also the largest paramilitary operation by the Canadian police in history. So anyway, during this year-long trial, all this information came out, all the dirty tricks the RCMP had done, the self-confessed smear campaign that they had engaged in, all this information came out. And then the Gustafson Lake defenders were welcomed as like heroes in a lot of communities. And it was over time, more people had a basic understanding around them. But the thing that was really crazy about that too was in BC, we already had a strong sovereigntist movement that based itself on the 1763 Royal Proclamation, that was part of the Canadian Constitution, that 1763 proclamation. So everything that the defenders were saying was what not only Indigenous sovereigntists had been saying, but band councils had been arguing in court since the 1970s. So there was nothing insane about their legal position. And it was just a really, it was crazy, but it was a real eye opener. And after that, that's all I did was Native stuff. So I wasn't too involved in the anti-capitalist stuff, anti-anarchist stuff, anti-fascist stuff. From there on, I was mostly that's all I was focused on was Indigenous people stuff and working with the Native youth movement and stuff like that. The one exception to that was in 2001 when I went to the Summit of the Americas protest in Quebec City. And then all through the years as well, I've mostly just been doing Indigenous people's social movement stuff now. But those are some of the things that had a big impact on me. In 1999, I did go down to the World Trade Center, organized the WTO protests in Seattle. And it was really weird for me, though. At the time, I was living in Bella Coola, it's a really small town with native reservations around it in the Newhawk territory. But I was living out of town along the side of the Bella Coola River in this remote cabin with no electricity and no running water and stuff like that. And we had no internet. I had no idea what was going on in the world, but some friends had come up and they were going down to this big protest. So they had gotten a group of us from Bella Coola, went down to Seattle for the WTO protests. And that was like, I had never seen so many people in the streets. It was incredible. You couldn't actually walk down streets. They were just packed with tens of thousands of people. And there was thousands and thousands of police. I'd never seen so much police either in my life. So that was a pretty big event. And it was called a riot and all this. There was a black bloc that carried out a really targeted attack, a bunch of property destruction, but they didn't even engage with police at all. But I know that it's called the WTO riots and stuff like that. But what I saw was mostly the police rioting. The police were basically chasing people up and down the streets, firing tear gas and rubber bullets. And the people were just kind of being moved around. There wasn't really any militant resistance going on. 2001, but that was a big event though, right? That inspired a lot of anti-capitalist organizing and mobilizing across North America. And I think even internationally, because stuff that happens in the US tends to have a bigger impact, right? Then when we got to 2001, there had been so much kind of militant organizing at that point that there was a black bloc of like 500 strong marching in the Summit of the Americas. And that was much more militant. And there was a lot more fighting with police. And you had the beginnings of this kind of revolutionary street movement. But then we had 9/11, the attacks of September 11th, 2001, with the World Trade Center is going down, and this big clampdown of these new anti-terrorist laws coming out. This national security state just kind of emerged, and people got really. There was a lot of kind of paranoia, but also fear of what was going to happen now. But it also really blunted that kind of militant anti-capitalist movement that had momentum, but that really put a damper on it. And then, of course, we entered into the global war on terror, which became, 2 decades of, invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. But I was, again, mostly focused on Indigenous resistance, working with the Native Youth Movement, the Secwepemc NYM, their campaign against Sun Peaks, and different kind of campaigns after that. But I think those are some of the more pivotal kind of events that had a big impact on me.
Thanks for sharing that. And there's so much richness in what you're describing. I mean, you're really a historian in the sense you're sharing these stories, and they're really you're telling it like it is from your eyewitness account, and I think as a challenge to, like you were saying earlier, the state propaganda, right? The state propaganda that frames people as terrorists, that frames people as guerrilla warriors, or however they're framed. I remember that Army manual that was leaked. I think it was in the early 2000s, that compared the warrior societies in Canada to Hezbollah, right? And so comparing them to these groups as a way to discredit their self-determination and as a way to discredit their activism. So, yeah, what for that. You've seen so much change, over the years. How have anarchist movements, and this is kind of a big question, but how do you see anarchist movements aligned with Indigenous movements today, as opposed to maybe in the early 1990s? Has there been a shift in your view? Maybe locally or even regionally?
I think in the late 80s, there were. I mean, I'm actually, back in the early 80s, I would say there was already a strong relationship between anarchist movement and the Indigenous movement. Because in the late 70s, actually in Vancouver, that was where the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee was formed, because that's where Leonard Peltier was being held pending his extradition hearing. So there was a strong movement there because American Indian movement members came to Vancouver to help in Leonard Peltier's defense campaign. And it was the local anarchists that really helped mobilize and gather a lot of resources for them to be able to do their work. So at that time, there was a strong connection with the anarchists in terms of Indigenous sovereignty movements. And then that kind of continued because there were sections of the anarchist movement that began to really take on ecological defense, environmental defense, as kind of a growing priority, because they saw this as leading to a catastrophic climate crisis back in the mid-1980s. So you had anarchist groups that start to focus a lot on the environment, and they start to support a lot of any kind of Indigenous land struggle that arose. They would go there to offer solidarity and support. And by the late 1980s, this had kind of spread to the anarchist movement across Canada. So you had groups in Ontario that were doing the same thing. And then with OCA 1990, you had a much larger kind of anarchist solidarity with Indigenous movements, because they're very inspired by this act of armed resistance, opposition to the state. And with the anarchist thing, the anarchists are like, they're against rulers, they're against established authorities, against centralized power. And so they organize in an autonomous, decentralized manner. And so a lot of anarchists see within Indigenous movements and Indigenous culture generally a lot of similarities with how they view an ideal type of society to be, which is, a lot of Indigenous cultures are kind of decentralized and they're more autonomous, is more egalitarian. Not all Indigenous cultures are like that, but I think for anarchists looking at Indigenous culture broadly speaking, and the movements that have arose from Indigenous peoples, they have a lot of sympathy with them, because they're not so much like centralized authorities. They're not like political parties. They're not trying to gain state power. So that's why anarchists are more attracted to give solidarity to Indigenous people's struggles. And I think they've contributed a lot through the years in terms of acting in solidarity or providing material resources to any kind of Indigenous land struggle that arises. And I think there's like, even the very idea of communism, uh, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, were inspired to some extent by indigenous cultures in North America that they kind of studied a little bit, including the Haudenosaunee. So they adopted their ideas of communism kind of based on looking at indigenous cultures. Um, and then, of course, their context was they're in Europe, and uh, there's a capitalist system that's been, established, and the working class, the proletarians, are a product of that system. And how do you get to a society that has no state and which is classless, that is, which is more egalitarian? And so their idea was communism, and the anarchists are kind of like a tendency that arose at the same time as an anti-capitalist movement. Like, how can we reorganize society so we're not living under this authoritarian state or under a capitalist economic system? But yeah, that's my kind of under my view of the anarchist solidarity with Native peoples. It's been fairly strong, I think, since the 1970s, fairly consistent. There are different anarchist tendencies, though, right? There are some, I think, that are just more urban based, more urban focused, or maybe more worker focused. They're trying to form unions and stuff like that. But I think generally there's a very strong solidarity coming from anarchists. I think more so than from the Marxist or communist left. I think it's stronger, and yeah, but.
Yeah, no, it seems like there's more of an affinity there with anarchists. And would you say it's gotten stronger over time, or those alignments just continue?
I think it has gotten stronger in some ways. I mean, I think certainly the Shutdown Canada campaign with the Unistaten, I think that was largely the result of these anarchist or autonomous networks. I know Indigenous peoples were a part of it, but the extent of it, especially in the urban areas, I think these anarchist networks played a big role in that, as well as a solidarity movement. So in that sense, I would say it has gotten stronger, definitely.
Absolutely. Well, and we're kind of getting towards the end of the questions, and I'm so appreciating the conversation. This is kind of a broader question, but what does life beyond the state look like for you? Thinking about, George Manuel at one point, talks about we're truly colonized if we can't imagine a life that is, or a form of governance that is beyond states. What does life beyond the state look like for you?
I think life beyond the state will probably manifest itself as a result of the breakdown of the state and its inability to exert control over the region or a region. Because I think these empires fall because of a convergence of crises, right? So we're seeing a convergence of crises right now. And I think that's what will create a life beyond the state, because then it's going to be communities are going to have to self-organize themselves. They're going to have to become more self-sufficient, because with the decline of the state, of course, the context is going to be the decline of a global capitalist system. The distribution system, all the infrastructure, all this stuff is going to decline. And so I think it's going to be up to communities to self-organize, get self-sufficient, think about growing food, community gardens. How are we going to sustain ourselves when there's no global infrastructure for transporting all these consumer items that we've become dependent on for our survival? When the stores no longer have food, there's no trucks driving those goods to the stores. There's no more container ships crossing the oceans, coming from China with all the electrical goods and all this stuff. That's what life beyond the state is going to I think that's how it's going to come to be. And I think Indigenous peoples, because we have these, I mean, outside of the urban areas, Indigenous peoples, because we're living on these reserves, we have these communities. And as dysfunctional as these communities may be, they are communities. They have a land base that they can start on. And, you know, when you have a breakdown in the system like that, it'll force people to come together. Like right now in Canada, you know, a lot of res is like, or even just in community in general, you know, you don't really need community. If you have welfare, you know, you have daycare, you have all these other services that are being provided by the state. So it's, I mean, it's part of the process that capitalism, it isolates, it breaks down the community, breaks down the family. I mean, we can see that clearly in colonization until you're like an individual unit. You're either an individual nuclear family unit or you're just an individual unit. So it creates all this isolation, and it makes us even more dependent on the state and all the services it can provide and all the infrastructure that it maintains. But when the state breaks down, you know, we're going to have to come together. And I think Indigenous peoples are going to be in a really good position to do that. And I think that's something that we should have an eye towards, is creating those, you know, conditions for self-sufficiency, because anybody who looks around can see that there's all these crises are going on, and it's only going to get worse. So it seems incumbent on us to start looking at ways that we can survive and be self-sufficient and maintain ourselves as communities and as people. And it's kind of weird because you don't really see it coming from, you know, any levels of government or even band councils, any kind of awareness about this. But I really think it's like up to the kind of like grassroots people to kind of try to encourage this mindset that we're going to have to become self-sufficient. We're going to have to, you know, once again, because that is what we were before colonization. We were completely self-sufficient, independent, sovereign peoples. And I think with the breakdown of the state, I mean, that's how we will achieve becoming these autonomous, sovereign communities again. But it's going to be in a very different kind of context, and we have to work in like a multinational kind of alliance now. You know, when we talked at the beginning about these pan-Indian alliances or internationalism, I think like in the context of North America, we really have to think about a multinational types of resistance movements, like, because it's not just Indigenous people. We have all these other peoples here in North America, some of whom form their own movements, you know, like a Black Liberation Movement, you know, the Mexica, Latinos. You have these different movements that we are probably going to want to make alliances with. And, you know, like I said, it's a really volatile time right now, and there's a lot of potential for change, but there's a lot of risk as well, I think. And I think people just need to kind of be thinking about getting prepared.
Oh, thanks for that. Last two questions. With all this in mind, what kind of projects are you working on these days? What are some of the things that really excite you?
I've been just doing comics for different groups. Like the most recent one I did was a comic with the Homolko First Nation, where they had interviewed a bunch of their elders about some of the traditional practices in their culture. And so there's 3 artists. I was one of them, and I got the chapters on hunting and food preservation. So I thought that was kind of a cool project because it's for today's generation. It's in a graphic novel format for them to kind of like look at and to think about, oh, this was you know, some of the ways our ancestors did things. And to me, that type of knowledge can be really valuable, considering the future that I just talked about, where we're going back to more self-sufficient lifestyles and stuff like that. So all this ancestral knowledge that we have, you know, as much as we can, we kind of want to maintain it and have it accessible for people. So those types of projects excite me. And then other than that, I just do our traditional art with making carvings like paddles or paintings and stuff like that, because I think that's an important part of maintaining the culture as well, is practicing it. So I do a lot of painting and carving aside from these types of the graphic novels or the graphics and logos for groups and stuff like that. I still try to practice just the painting and the carving of our ancestral crests, stuff like that.
Excellent. Well, Wado, thank you, Gord. Gilakasla, thank you so much for spending this time together and for this great conversation. So really appreciate it.